So I'm going to talk about systems approaches and their application to research integrity. And I'm working on the assumption that people aren't familiar with systems methods. And so I'm going to say a little bit about what they are, then say how we can use them to address issues that are of interest to us in research integrity, and then give a couple of examples where they have been used to study the diffusion of ideas and methods. So this is a very simple systems model. It's from the Institute of Medicine report. It shows a research organization that we would work in. It has outputs, it has inputs. So for example, if you work in a university, one of our outputs is students. We graduate students. We may have our own ideas and standards about who should and shouldn't graduate, but we're constrained by the organizations we work in. For example, if you work in a school that's accredited, you have to have so many programs. Once you have the programs, you have to populate them with students. Once you populate them with students, you have to graduate the students. Your ability to do that is dependent on the resources within your organization. For example, how many faculty you have. Depending on how many faculty you have, how many students you have, you may do a good job. A good job would be an output. For example, do they get publications? Do they get good publications? Do they get jobs? Do they get good jobs? The extent to which you do that will then feed back to your student pool. If your students don't get publications and don't get jobs, then your application pool will probably diminish, and so this will have a negative feedback. If you do a good job, you'll get better applicants and your outputs will be better. So that's a simple systems model. This is, in order to make these models run, you have to use either math or some kind of computer code. So again, here's a very simple model. This says potential adopters, and these are people who have adopted something, an idea. So let's say people who have adopted p-hacking, or people who have adopted registered reports. So there's a pool of people who are susceptible to that. Let's say graduate students, they come in to our organization, there's a pool of them, and there's a rate at which they flow from being potential adopters to being adopters. And that rate is affected by these things that drive it. So for example, the adoption by word of mouth. You've never heard of registered reports before, you come here, you hear about it, and therefore you adopt that. The more people who have adopted it, the more likely you are to hear about it, and that will affect the rate at which there's a flow through from here to here. If hardly anybody uses registered reports, you're not likely to hear about it, and you're likely to stay as a potential adopter because you're never exposed to that idea. If lots of people are doing it, you'll be exposed, and the flow will be greater from the potential adoption to the adoption. So there are three basic types of models that people use in who do systems models. One is a system dynamics model. The thing I showed earlier there was an example. Here you have stocks or compartments. So these will be things like groups of individuals or products. So your stock could be publications. You have flows from one stock to the other. You have drivers of those flows. And the sort of question you can ask with a systems dynamic model would be, why does psychology produce so many papers with false positive results? So why does this discipline, I apologize if you're a psychologist, most of my examples will be about psychology. Why do psychologists produce a bad product? Why do they produce so many publications that have false positive results in them? Another type of model is an agent-based model. And here you have, instead of pools or stocks of people, you have individual agents. And they have traits and characteristics. They can be individuals, they can be labs, they can be research teams. They interact with one another, and they occupy an environment or a space. And here, the reason you would have individual agents and not stocks is you assume that the things that heterogeneity is important. So you don't treat everybody as equally susceptible, for example. So you would think that, so let's say something like the Bayesian analysis that we talked about yesterday, you would think that people were there was variability in the extent to which people could adopt that idea. So I, for example, will never be able to do that. I've seen EJ's talk twice. Bayes could appear in my office every day like the ghost of Jacob Marley and sit there for a whole semester, and I will never catch Bayesianism. I don't have the statistical skills to catch that particular idea. So I'm immune to it. So in that case, you would want to include that in your model, that there are some people who simply won't be able to do this, however much they're exposed to it. So another thing that agent-based models are good at doing is looking at emergent phenomena. So they can address a question like, well, how did the credibility crisis in psychology emerge? So it didn't emerge through people getting together and saying, hey, should we create a credibility crisis in our discipline? It emerged from thousands or tens of thousands of people saying, I need to publish a paper. Journals like positive results. Therefore, I need a positive result. Therefore, I'm going to p-hack my data and write a paper about it. And when thousands or tens of thousands of people do that, the emergent phenomenon is a discipline that's full of false positive results. So what you see at a group level, at a macro level, is driven by individual processes that were never intended to produce that macro level effect. And the final types of model we use are network models. Again, these can be individual labs, academic disciplines. There are paths or ties between the nodes, and we try and transmit things through those nodes. So a sort of question we could ask regarding research integrity with a network model is, how did blind data analysis diffuse through particle physics? Why did this idea diffuse through this particular discipline? Okay, so here's just a contrast. Here's the thing I showed before, the stock and flow model, where you have all the potential adopters, you have the adopters. With the agent-based model, everything that's in here becomes an individual agent. Okay, and that's because, as I said earlier, you're interested in heterogeneity and you're not interested in grouping people or lumping people together. Here's a simple network model. This is a model. I'm a catalyst. This is one of my catalyst activities. This is me. This is a doctoral student. What I'm trying to get this doctoral student to do is use blind data analysis. So that's what I'm trying to transmit down this node. He's not in my department. He's in the HPM department. These are the other people on his committee. They form a little network that I'm not part of because I'm not in his department. I've coloured them differently because one of them, the chair, was kind of skeptical about this, and that's fine. You know, skepticism's a good thing. But he was skeptical about the idea. One of them was really keen, and the other one's kind of neutral. In order to persuade this individual to use blind data analysis, I'm probably going to have to form a tie with one of these individuals and tip them. I probably will be insufficient to persuade him to do that. So I have to kind of restructure this network and make this tie stronger and form some ties with these other individuals. I think the prospects for doing that are probably fairly reasonable. Here's another catalyst activity I have. I teach a class online to 7 students. 5 of them are master's students, 2 are doctoral students. I transmit a lot. There's a lot of information. I talk about Harkin, false discovery, CONSORT, child registration, blind data analysis, conflict of interest. I transmit a lot of information, but I don't actually transmit any skills. Nobody's been required to do anything. These people here may never do research, so even transmitting the stuff to them, they may never actually do anything with it. The 2 doctoral students will, but I'm not on either of their committees. So again, I have much less influence on them than these people do. And so I may transmit a lot of information, none of which actually results in anything. They may never use any of these techniques. It's like I've sneezed on them over and over again, but none of them are actually going to get sick. And you could say, what's an impact assessment? You may want to say that I should, at least with the doctoral students, at least one of them should use one of these procedures like registered reports or blind data analysis in their future publications. If they don't, then I haven't, maybe I haven't been that successful with the course. So what sort of questions can we answer with these methods? Well, one is how the disease spread and diffuse through groups. How emergent phenomena can unintentionally arise through behaviours of individual actors. We talked about that a moment ago. How institutions and agents resist attempts to correct dysfunction and protect their interests. So that we've got to be aware of negative feedback, and there was some discussion of that yesterday with the change in p-values. And how can we have unintended consequences? So again, will change in the p-value just lead to more p-hacking? We don't really know. There seems to be some uncertainty about that. So I think these methods are very good for looking at unintended consequences of intervention. So for example, if we look at CONSORT, the effects of CONSORT seem to have been modest at best. There's a number of studies that have come out that show that adherence to CONSORT is not that great amongst journals that adhere to the CONSORT statement. Again, trial registration hasn't been very successful in curtailing presentation of exploratory analysis as a priori hypothesis. So here are two things that we've introduced that we thought would improve the quality of research, and the evidence seems to suggest that it hasn't been that successful in doing it. And the reason for that is people resist attempts to correct their behaviour, and they very quickly learn to game a system. So the problem may be that CONSORT and trial registration it may be the gaming of them that's diffused and not actually adherence to them. So it may be that we've put these obstacles in place to try and correct people's behaviour in terms of how they report their data in publications, but all they do is they learn how to game the system. And the problem with that is not only would it not be very effective, it may have a negative effect because it would give journal readers a false sense of security that there's been some quality control with the publications they're reading when there actually hasn't been. So not only may it not work, it may have a net detrimental effect. And so we can use these methods to conduct virtual experiments and sort of what if. So what if psychology looks more like particle physics? Would things like blind data analysis diffuse better through that? We can speed up these experiments and the diffusion of interventions and look at their effects in simulated time, not in real time. And we can use the results to guide the decisions about how we implement our solutions or our interventions. So for example, are some disciplines more ripe for change than others? So if we're going to do something like registered reports, would we be better at targeting it at some sub-disciplines rather than just letting people sort of pick and choose whether they do it? Are there some disciplines that are ripe for change and are more susceptible to change than others? So I'll just run through a couple of examples to show how these methods have been used. So this is a paper by Betancourt published in 2006, and it looked at the diffusion of Feynman diagrams amongst physicists in the US, Japan, and Russia starting in 1948. So the diffusion of these diagrams, and these are basically things that physicists use and it helps them to do. So it's not a corrective mechanism, it's something that enables them to do their research more efficiently and better. So you would think people would want to adopt these. So diffusion was measured by the number of authors adopting Feynman diagrams. Adoption was measured by publications between 1948 and 1960, and they used epidemic models to examine the dynamics of the diffusion. So for example, how quickly did they diffuse through these populations? Did they diffuse differently through the populations? And how many secondary cases did each adopter produce? So for each person who adopted the technique, how many other people did they infect? And they used a simple basic SIR model, so individuals were susceptible to using the diagrams, they were exposed to the diagrams, they were infected, i.e. they were using them, and some people could recover. You could use them and then not use them anymore in your research. Or you could exit here and become a skeptic. So So somebody who not only didn't use them, but was skeptical about using them and published papers saying they weren't a very good idea. So it's a fairly simple stock and flow model. Okay, so what did they find? They found that the velocity, so here is, the blue one is the US, this is Japan, and this is Russia. So one thing to notice is there was greater contact between scientists in the US and Japan than in Russia. So they started in America, Feynman was an American, and they spread fairly quickly to Japan because there was contact between those two academic communities of physicists, whereas they took longer to spread to Russia, where there wasn't that contact. The velocity and the rho, i.e. the number of people each individual infected with the idea, was greater in Japan than in the other two countries. 80% of adopters were grad students and postdocs, which I think is interesting. You know, innovation's a young person's game. It's no accident that most people in this room are young. It's not full of a bunch of people my age. Okay, it's you know, I say it's not surprising that younger people adopt these techniques and not older researchers. And the number of secondary cases that arose from each individual who adopted the Feynman diagrams was between 50 and 60. And that was basically because of the years in which the ideas could be transmitted. If you were infected as a graduate student, then you had a lot of years ahead of you when you can persuade other people to use these methods. So again, we may be better off with targeting this group rather than people my age, because I've probably got 5 or 6 or 10 years at best left to spread these ideas, whereas most of you have a lot longer. Here's another example, if I have time just to do this one. This was a network analysis published by Kiss et al. in 2010. And this looked at the diffusion of kinesin. It's a protein. I know nothing about it. I may not even be pronouncing it right, but it's a protein, and it was discovered in 1985. And they were looking at the diffusion of this from biochemistry and cell biology to the biological sciences, to biomedical sciences, to other natural sciences like chemistry and physics. So how did the science of this spread through these various disciplines? So their network was 171 academic disciplines. Diffusion was measured by publications altogether. There were over 4,000 of them. Started in 1985 when there were 2, ended in 2007 when there were 394. And each discipline was either susceptible, incubating, or exposed. That is, they were aware of the idea and there was some publication activity, or they were infected and they were actively publishing papers on this area. So again, very simple model, just 3 stocks. And this is 1994, so here's the publication activity in this area here, which I'm having trouble reading those, but it's between basically clinical sciences, and so all the publication activity is centered here. And this is how it spread out over time. So infected, it spread out into these areas, but also spread out beyond these into, that says physics there, and I'm not sure what that says, but you can see that it's concentrated here, and over time it diffuses and spreads out along these networks to other disciplines. And what they found was that the research on kinesins diffused in a manner similar to a disease. So the most basic SI model was a good fit to the empirical data. So these are the empirical data of the academic disciplines active in kinesin-related research over time, and this is the model. So the basic model was a good fit to the data. Again, some of the implications for the sort of things that we're interested in. Diffusion of this discovery was slow. It would take 4 to 15 years to diffuse. Okay, and I would argue that diffusion of research integrity solutions that actually very often increase the cost of doing research may be even slower. Okay, so things like registered reports that increase the cost of doing research and may actually end up giving you a product that's less citable. That may lead to a fairly slow diffusion of that type of procedure. Also, there were no skeptics or dissenters in that model to slow diffusion. Again, I think in research integrity area, there are people who are skeptical and who would be opposed to some of the things that we've been talking about. So that could slow the diffusion even further. There was no recovery, so there weren't people who used this technique and then stopped using it. So once infected, everybody, the discipline remained infected. Again, that's not necessarily the case in research integrity solutions. There may be people who use them and then stop using them and may be immune to their further use. Diffusion was more likely to occur amongst discipline with existing knowledge flows. Okay, so that has implications for solutions that are developed in very specific disciplines. So there was that recent paper in Nature by McCown and Perlmutter where they argue that blind data analysis that's used in particle physics would be useful if it was applied in psychology. Now, I'm not sure how great the knowledge flows between particle physics and psychology are, so that may be a hard sell. In fact, I contacted McCown and asked him for some papers where it's been used outside physics, and he sent me 2 papers. So it may be hard for that to break out of particle physics into other disciplines. And I think diffusion of the sort of things we're interested in may be better thought of as a complex contagion rather than a simple contagion. So certain things spread easily. So I have friends, whenever a rock star dies, and my brother or one of my friends contacts me. So I know almost immediately when David Bowie or Tom Petty die. Okay, and once one of them told me, that's it, I know it. So that's a simple contagion. I just, they tell me I know it, and 10 other people tell me it doesn't make any difference. With the sort of things we're doing, they're more complex than that. They're costly and risky behaviors. So they may be harder to diffuse. They're not going to diffuse simply like the death of Tom Petty. And they may require prior expertise to catch them. So the example I gave with the Bayesian thing earlier on, I can just never catch that. I don't have the ability to catch that. They may require reinforcement from multiple sources. Again, the example I gave with the doctoral student, maybe me telling him to do it isn't going to be enough. He's going to need 1 or 2 of those other committee members to come on board, and then we can tip him. And the trust and legitimacy and the credibility of the source matters. Again, it doesn't really matter who tells you that Tom Petty died, but it probably does matter who's telling you to use blind data analysis. Okay, if you don't, if you don't have, that person doesn't have much legitimacy or credibility, then you're likely to, take it or leave it. So just to finish, so systems models can help us understand how bad science has diffused. It can help us identify leverage points for interventions. It can help us assess potential effectiveness of interventions. We can anticipate negative feedbacks. You will have to get a mathematician, an engineer, or computer science to work with you, and that's quite hard to do. And there are reporting standards for these things. So the sort of thing that we're interested in, there are reporting standards. This one's for agent-based models, that one's for systems dynamic models. If you're interested in these models, there's a very good paper by Luke and Stamaticus in the Annual Review of Public Health that describes the 3 models. There's a very good paper and there's a very good book by Sterman on system dynamics models. And I recently wrote a paper with Elkins and Lawley that's coming out in Science and Engineering Ethics that looks at the application of these to issues of research integrity. So we have a model in there of registered reports, for example. We have a system dynamic model of that, and we have a disease model of research integrity. So this has different types of models to the ones I talked about today. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. Great presentation. A plug for Dennis's paper. If you haven't read it, I think it's really great. I think this is a very useful way for us to see aspects of the problem and ways to solve it that are less myopic than perhaps we've been doing previously. So I guess my question, if you have any ideas off the top of your head, is there a particular area where you think you'd start to do an application of it? I think the paper's a great introduction to the potential benefits of using systems thinking and the methods within that thinking for this area. Is there a problem, a space where you think a particular type of systems method you've gone through today would be a great place to start to actually demonstrate the argument that you've made?
The paper that we published, that has some examples in it. So one is, as I say, there's a production model where the stock is publications, and we look at the flow of publications through two different processes. One is the regular publication process, and the other is the registered reports process. So we have sort of drivers and stocks and in that particular model. I think that's a potential application. Another one, and the thing we talk about in the paper, is looking at different disciplines. So I say I'm interested in the idea, this notion that blind data analysis, for some reason, so the story goes, did diffuse very quickly through particle physics. And I wonder why. Why would a discipline decide to start doing something that at some level wasn't really in its interest? And I did write to Perlmutter, and I'd never heard back from him. And then I found out he was a Nobel Prize winner, so he was bound not to reply to my email. I was just curious, why? So those sort of questions interest me. Why would a discipline start doing something that at some level wasn't in the interest of the researchers in that field? Why would you make things more difficult for yourself? So I'd like to understand the conditions under which they did that and see whether you could create a model of that and then apply that model to other disciplines. What would we have to do to other disciplines to make them do the thing that seems to have gone on in particle physics? So it's like a sort of virtual experiment that you could never do in the real world. That's the beauty of these things. You could never make psychology like particle physics in the real world, but in a virtual world you can do that. And then you can identify the things that you then may want to go and try and change in the real world. What's doable and what's not doable.
One more question from the audience? Damn it, Matt, we can't just break for coffee. So one more round of applause.